Hi guys, good morning. So today we're going to be continuing what we were learning about last week when we talked about the National Assembly and the three things that the National Assembly caused. So if you remember, we talked about how they wanted to overthrow the government and take over and change the way things were done so that it was fair for everyone. And I told you that there were three things that happened because of the National Assembly. So one of the things was the storming of the Bastille, which we talked about last week, which is when they went in to the place where they kept the guns and the swords and the weapons, and they took them, and then they used them to destroy the building and also to destroy the homes of rich people who lived out in the country. So this week, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizenship. Now, I know that's a really long name. It is, but we're going to be talking about what that is and what it did. So it was signed and created on August 27th, 1789. So it's a document kind of like the Declaration of Independence that we learned about with America. So the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizenship had three main goals. So there were three things they wanted people to understand when they read this document. The first one is all men are born equal. So that means that all people are equal and the same. And they all deserve to be treated equal and the same. No matter how much money they make, no matter what color their skin is, they're all the same. The second thing is the goal of all political association is to keep the rights of man. These rights are liberty, so freedom, property, security, which means safety, and resistance to oppression. So what this means, because I know it's a big fancy way to say this, is that the point of the government is to protect our rights. So the point of the government, they said, was to make sure that all people were getting what they needed and were being treated the right way. So the things that they believe that all people deserve is liberty. Liberty is just another word for freedom. Property, so the right to own things. Security, which is their safety. The government's job is to make sure that they're safe and that they're not in danger. And resistance to oppression, so they said that the government should protect them from being oppressed. And then the third one, no one person can have control over the country again. It has to be a council of people. So instead of having a king, they were going to have a group of people who make decisions. So they still had a king. They allowed Louis XIV to continue being the king, but he wasn't allowed to make any decisions. He was the king because France said, well, we've always had a king. What are we going to do with him? What are we going to do with the palace? So they still let him be king, but he doesn't get to have any say. Just like today in Great Britain, England has a queen, but she doesn't make any decisions. She's just sort of a figure. So before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what your homework is. So write this down because it's your homework. I'm going to remind you in the instructions of this video, but a lot of you don't read the instructions of this video, so here I am telling you that this is your homework. Alright? What 5 rights, so think of 5 rights, do you think are essential? So what that means is, what rights do you think all human beings should have? Alright? So I want you to think about that. I want you to write it down. I want you to write it in English, in complete sentences. I shouldn't have to keep telling you to write things in English because this class is in English. But there's a lot of you who are still writing things in Spanish, and I'm not giving you credit for those things. You speak English. Most of you do. Alright? So, either write this on a piece of paper and take a picture of it, or type it. Okay? So that's your homework. Alright, let's move on and talk about the March of the Women. So the lower class, so the third estate, was still very unhappy. They were unhappy because even though they were free, they were still hungry and they still couldn't feed their family. So the rest of the slide says people are still poor and cannot feed their families. Just because they are free, it doesn't mean their problems went away. I said that in a different order than it's written, so I wanted to read it to you. On October 5th, thousands of angry, starving women marched to Versailles to protest. So do you remember what protesting is? We've talked about it before. A protest is when you go tell the government that something is wrong. You guys have seen them on the news a lot. There are usually protests in Oaxaca City in front of the government buildings. There have been a lot of protests in the United States and in Europe lately. You've seen a protest. So that's what they're doing. They're going to tell the government, hey, we don't like this thing that you're doing. So they said that the king should be arrested for what he did to the country. So for putting the country in debt. They also wanted him to live in Paris, where the problems were, and not in Versailles out in the country. So they said that they felt like King Louis was hiding from the country's problems because he was just staying out in Versailles, which is in the country, it's far away from everything, and they didn't think that that was fair. So some threats. The king didn't want to leave the palace of Versailles, so the women fought his guards. They also threatened his family if he did not go to Paris, saying that they would break into Versailles and kill them all. So naturally, because of this, he went to Paris, and he and his family were imprisoned there. So they still lived in the palace, but they weren't allowed to leave the palace ever for any reason. So the last thing I want us to talk about today is churches. We're going to talk more about the church next week, but for right now, I just want you to understand a few things about what the church was like during this time. So the new government took land from the Catholic Church and gave it to the people. So remember we said that they were making everybody equal and getting rid of feudalism. So they were saying that now the people could own the land that they worked on instead of having to pay rent on it constantly that they couldn't afford. So churches were no longer powerful and people began to think differently. Richer churches bought their land back from the people. So the reason I say that churches were no longer powerful and people began to think differently. The church controlled how people thought because the people couldn't read. So if you couldn't read something, you would have to believe whatever someone told you, right? So the church was telling people what was right and what was wrong. And sometimes they would tell people the truth, and sometimes they would tell people lies. So they would do things they wanted them to do, or so they would think a certain way. So next week we're going to talk more about what that means and how a lot of times we take the Bible and we can change it so that it means what we want it to mean instead of what God wanted it to mean. All right? So remember, your homework, I'm going to say it again because there's a lot of you who do not read and will go, Miss, I don't understand. What is my homework? Your homework is to either write and take a picture or to type. What 5 rights do you think are essential? What rights do you think all human beings should have? All right, so I want you to think about that, and I want you to either send me a picture of it or type it for me, okay? All right, I'll talk to you guys later.